Madam President.
Majority Whip.
Madam President, I rise today in the Senate to pass the Defiance Act, a bipartisan bill that provides a remedy for victims of non-consensual sexual exploitation deepfakes. And I want to thank the Senate co-sponsors of this legislation. They include my ranking Republican member, Senator Lindsey Graham, the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, as well as Senators Klobuchar, Hawley, King, and Lee. This bill is truly bipartisan. And I've been proud to partner with the New York Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who introduced this legislation in the House of Representatives with 4 Republican and 4 Democratic co-sponsors. As you can see in both the Senate and the House, this is a bipartisan measure, and when I describe it, you'll understand. Sadly, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez herself is a victim of what is known as explicit deepfakes. I commend her for her work and courage to create tools for victims in the fight against this despicable conduct. The spread of these deplorable deepfakes is like a fire burning out of control. What used to take extraordinary technological expertise and a lot of time can now be done with the push of a button. Countless apps can swap someone's face onto another person's body or can digitally remove someone's clothing. These apps are often advertised as harmless entertainment, but when explicit images are produced and shared without the consent of the person depicted, the harm is very real. The exploitation of young children, the exploitation of women is really the price that's being paid for this. Imagine losing control over your own likeness and identity. Imagine how powerless victims feel when they cannot remove the illicit content, cannot prevent it from being reproduced, and cannot prevent new images from being created. The negative consequences to the victims can be profound. Victims may draw into silence themselves by withdrawing from online spaces and public discourse as a protective measure. They may endure threats to their employment, education, or reputation, or suffer additional criminal activity such as extortion and stalking. Some experience depression, anxiety, and fear of being in public, and in the worst case scenario, victims are driven to suicide. Representative Ocasio-Cortez recently described her own reaction to being depicted in sexual deepfakes without her consent. She said, and I quote, "There's a shock to seeing images of yourself that someone could think are real." She described how it resurfaced trauma and haunts her thoughts. Once these deepfakes are seen, they cannot be unseen. As she put it, quote, "Deepfakes are a way of digitizing violent humiliation against other people." Prominent women are often the target of non-consensual sexually explicit deepfakes. Singers, actors, politicians alike. You cannot escape the conclusion that these images are intended to diminish and shame women. But sadly, the victims can be anyone. There are many distressing reports this year of middle school and high school struggling to respond to the spread of sexually explicit deepfakes of students. In March of this year, at least 22 students at the Richmond Burton High School in McHenry County in my home state of Illinois learned they were depicted in deepfakes circulating online. One of the images was a doctored version of a photo of 2 female students taken at the school prom. The perpetrator digitally removed their clothes to make it appear that they were unclothed. The prom is supposed to be a joyous rite of passage for teenagers, a happy memory they keep for the rest of their lives. And now that memory has been stolen from these 2 young women. Sadly, we are seeing an explosion of images like these. One researcher found that the number of non-consensual, pornographic, deep life videos available online has increased 9-fold in the last 5 years. Such videos have been viewed almost 4 billion times. 4 billion times. Monthly traffic to the top 20 deepfake sites increased by 285% from July 2020 to July 2023. Search engines directed 25 million visits to the top 5 most popular deepfake sites in July 2023 alone. And tragically, under the law now, the victims have no legal remedy. Time and again, victims are told nothing can be done to help them because existing laws simply do not apply to deepfakes. This is not just a gap in the law. It's an omission that shows a blatant disregard for the trauma of children, women, and girls who are victimized by this crime. But this Defiance Act will change that. It will give the victims a day in court. Once this bill is signed into law, victims finally will have the ability to hold civilly liable those who produce, disclose, solicit, or possess sexually explicit deepfakes, while knowingly or recklessly disregarding that the person depicted did not consent to the conduct. I'm proud that we've collaborated with the survivors' advocates on this bill. They have lived experience and leadership and have shaped this bill. This bill was carefully crafted to comply with the First Amendment. As the Center for Democracy and Technology wrote in their letter endorsing the bill, it is constitutional because it addresses, quote, a uniquely compelling problem with a narrowly tailored solution. In addition to the CDT, the Defiance Act is supported by the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, the Sexual Violence Prevention Association, the National Women's Law Center, My Image, My Choice, PACT, Rights for Girls, and many others. Congress has waited too long to act. Can you imagine in your own family if it was your wife, your daughter, your niece, or some young woman that you love who was exploited this way, who had to see these images and try to erase them from their minds, who realize that they have no power now under the law, no power to protect themselves. They are helplessly exploited, and their lives can be changed for the worse. We have waited far too long to act. This is a bipartisan measure in both the House and the Senate. It is past time to give victims of non-consensual sexual exploitation and explicit deepfakes the tools they need to fight back. Madam President, notwithstanding Rule 22, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Judiciary be discharged from further consideration of S3696, the Disrupt Explicit Forged Images and Non-Consensual Edits Act of 2024, and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I further ask consent that the Durbin-Grassley substitute amendment at the desk be agreed to. The bill is amended be considered read a third time and passed, and the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there an objection? Wyoming.
Reserving the right to object, I strongly support the intent behind this legislation. We must combat the deeply harmful practice of non-consensual deepfake pornography. It is as serious as the gentleman from Illinois just described. But I'm troubled that this bill, as currently drafted, is overly broad in scope. The expansive definitions and wide net of liability in this bill could lead to unintended consequences that stifle American technological innovation and development. By extending liability to third-party platforms that may unknowingly host this illicit content, I worry this bill places an untenable burden on online services to constantly police user-generated posts. Even platforms making good faith efforts to remove illegal deepfakes could become inundated with frivolous litigation. A more prudent approach would be to tailor legislation to focus on publishers and knowing distributors. And such legislation exists. It is the Cruz-Klobuchar bill. We must ensure that in our noble efforts to prevent abuse, we do not inadvertently impose overbroad restrictions and spur excessive lawsuits that would chill the development of American emerging technologies. I stand ready to work with my colleagues to find this crucial balance. For these reasons, I object. And I
Objection is heard.
Madam President,
Majority Whip.
I'm disappointed, seriously disappointed. When we talk about these young women and young children being exploited and have bipartisan legislation before both the House and the Senate to deal with it, it is important that it be characterized properly. First, there is no liability under this proposed law for tech platforms, despite what was said by the gentlelady from Wyoming. And secondly, the idea that the people would suffer civil liability here when they didn't know what was going on. Listen to the language of this bill. Victims have the ability to hold civilly liable those who produce, disclose, solicit, possess sexually explicit deepfakes while knowingly or recklessly disregarding the person that depicted did not consent to the conduct. The two major issues raised by the gentlelady from Wyoming, the senator from Wyoming, are both addressed in this bipartisan measure. There are people who will shake their heads and say, can't the Senate even address this issue, the sexual exploitation of children and young girls and attempts to ruin their lives? Can't they even agree on a bipartisan basis to come up with an answer? We did. We have a bill that does it, and it's been stopped. We're not going to stop our efforts, Madam President. This is a cause worth fighting for, and we're going to really appeal to those across America who believe as we do. I yield the floor.